The hospital bill trembled in Rachel Morrison's manicured hands, but her eyes held no compassion for the man sitting beside their unconscious daughter's bed. David Morrison had been her husband for 12 years, but poverty had stripped away whatever love she'd once pretended to feel. Their daughter Emma lay dying of leukemia in that sterile room, but Rachel's mind was already racing toward a different future, one that didn't include medical debt or a failed contractor who couldn't afford experimental treatments. David sat hunched in his threadbare jacket, exhausted from working 3 jobs, but Rachel saw only weakness where determination lived. The irony burned through the universe like cosmic justice. That very morning, David's phone had buzzed with a message from Thornwood and Associates, informing him that his estranged uncle, whom he'd never mentioned because Rachel mocked his trash family, had died. But the 20-page inheritance document, sitting unread in his email, revealed an empire worth $1.2 trillion, spanning tech companies, real estate conglomerates, and international holdings. Rachel didn't know this, but her ignorance would cost her everything. She'd already made her choice. David's best friend since college, Marcus Webb, had been whispering promises in her ear for months. But those promises were built on Marcus's assumption that he'd soon be promoted to senior vice president at his firm. Rachel was kicking David out tonight, demanding divorce papers by morning, but she hadn't counted on the security footage that would later reveal her affair had started 2 years ago, right when Emma's diagnosis had first devastated their family. David would sign those papers without protest, but his silence came from somewhere deeper than defeat. The Thornwood inheritance required 30 days of confidentiality before public announcement, but those 30 days would give David time to build something his wife never saw coming. Rachel planned to marry Marcus within weeks, but the universe had already written their ending. What would Rachel feel when she discovered the poor husband she'd discarded was actually the wealthiest man in the Western Hemisphere? What would break inside Marcus when he realized the woman he'd betrayed his best friend for had walked away from unlimited resources that could have saved Emma's life instantly? What revenge would a grieving father craft when given unlimited power and a heart full of righteous fury? The fluorescent lights of County General Hospital flickered with bureaucratic indifference, but Rachel Morrison sat beneath them, scrolling through Marcus Webb's text messages with the focus of someone planning an escape. Her husband David slumped in the chair beside her, but she didn't bother looking at the man who'd given her 12 years of what she now considered wasted youth. Their daughter Emma, 9 years old with her father's gentle brown eyes, lay motionless in the bed before them, but the machines keeping her alive beeped with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown Rachel had grown tired of hearing. The oncologist says the experimental trial could work, but we'd need to raise $80,000 by Friday, David said softly, but his voice carried the hoarse quality of someone who'd already begged every bank, every charity, every friend they'd ever known. I talked to my boss about another advance. Stop. Rachel's word cut through the sanitized air like a scalpel, but her eyes never left her phone screen. Just stop, David. I can't do this anymore. David's hands stilled on the hospital bill he'd been staring at for the past hour, but something in his wife's tone made his blood temperature drop. Can't do what? Rachel finally looked at him, but her expression carried all the warmth of a corporate layoff notice. This, us, any of it. She gestured vaguely at Emma's unconscious form, but the callousness of the movement made David's stomach turn. I've been trying to make this work for years, but you're drowning us. We can't save her, David. We don't have the money. We don't have anything. The words landed like physical blows, but David's response came out barely above a whisper. She's our daughter. She's a little girl who deserves better than what we can give her, Rachel said, but her justification sounded rehearsed, like she'd been practicing this speech in mirrors. and I deserve better than watching you fail over and over while pretending your construction jobs are going to somehow manifest $80,000. David stood slowly, but his movements carried the careful control of someone holding back an earthquake of emotion. "What are you saying, Rachel?" She met his eyes directly now, but there was something almost triumphant in her gaze. "I want a divorce. I want you out of the house tonight. Marcus is going to—" She caught herself, but the slip was enough. "Marcus?" The name escaped David like a breath he'd been holding for months, without realizing it, but suddenly dozens of small observations aligned into a pattern he'd been too exhausted to see. "Marcus Webb? My best friend Marcus?" Rachel's chin lifted defensively, but she didn't deny it. "He's successful. He's about to make senior VP. He can give me the life I was supposed to have before I made the mistake of marrying someone who thought loyalty was more important than ambition." The hospital room seemed to tilt sideways, but David gripped the back of Emma's chair to steady himself. "How long? Does it matter?" Rachel was already standing, gathering her designer purse that cost more than David made in a week, but the accessory was a gift from Marcus. David understood that now. "I'll have my lawyer send papers to whatever motel you end up in. You have until tomorrow night to get your things out of the house." "And Emma," David's voice cracked on their daughter's name, but Rachel was already halfway to the door. "The doctors say she has maybe 3 weeks without the treatment," Rachel said, but she delivered this death sentence with the emotional inflection of someone discussing grocery lists. "You can visit during approved hours. I'm listing you as non-custodial parent." "You can't," David started, but Rachel spun back with sudden venom. "I can do whatever I want. You don't have money for lawyers. You don't have money for anything." She paused in the doorway, but her final words carried the precision of someone who'd been saving them. "You were supposed to be something, David. Your mother told me you had potential, but potential doesn't mean anything when you're too weak to reach it. Marcus knows how to take what he wants. That's why I'm choosing him." The door whispered shut behind her, but the silence she left behind roared louder than any words. David sank back into his chair, but his hand instinctively reached for Emma's small fingers, careful not to disturb the IV line. His phone buzzed in his pocket, had been buzzing periodically all day, actually, but he'd been too focused on his daughter to notice. He pulled it out with his free hand, but exhaustion made the screen blur. 17 missed calls, 23 unread emails, all from a sender he didn't recognize. Thornwood and Associates Legal Division. David's thumb hovered over the delete button, probably debt collectors using a new tactic, but something made him open the most recent message instead. The email was long, dense with legal terminology, but certain phrases jumped out with the impact of lightning strikes. "Regret to inform you of the passing of Jameson Thornwood. Your mother's brother, estranged from the family since 1987. Sole living heir as specified in revised testament dated January 2024. Total estate value assessed at $1.2 trillion US. 30-day confidentiality clause per deceased's wishes. Portfolio includes Thornwood Technologies, Apex Real Estate International, 17 subsidiary companies." David read the email 3 times, but his brain couldn't process the numbers. Trillion, not million, not billion, trillion. He scrolled down to the attached documents. 116 pages of legal verification, asset listings, corporate ownership structures. His mother had never mentioned having a brother, but then again, his mother had died when he was 7, taking most of his family history with her. His phone rang, the name Patricia Thornwood, lead executor, flashing on the screen, but David's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the device. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. I've been trying to reach you all day. I understand this is overwhelming, but we need to discuss the inheritance immediately. Your uncle's will contains specific clauses that require— Is this real? David interrupted, but his voice sounded distant to his own ears. Completely verified and legally binding, Patricia Thornwood confirmed, but she continued before he could respond. However, there's a confidentiality requirement. Your uncle was intensely private, no public announcement for 30 days, no disclosure to anyone who might leak information to media outlets. After that period, you're free to do as you wish, but until then, absolute discretion. Can you comply with those terms? David looked at Emma's pale face, at the machines breathing for her, but his mind was already calculating. The experimental treatment for my daughter, it costs $80,000. Can I— Mr. Morrison, you can buy the entire hospital if you choose, Patricia said, but her tone gentled slightly. However, given the confidentiality clause, I'd recommend more subtle approaches. We have medical consultants who can arrange anything your daughter needs through appropriate channels. I can have specialists en route within the hour. Something in David's chest that had been clenched tight for years suddenly released, but the relief was immediately replaced by something darker. My wife just asked for a divorce. There was a pause on the line, but Patricia's response was carefully neutral. I see. Given the circumstances, you may want to consult with our family law division before signing anything. We have extensive experience with complex matrimonial situations involving substantial assets. David's free hand tightened into a fist, but his voice remained steady. She doesn't know about this. She thinks I'm a failure. She's leaving me for my best friend. I understand, Patricia said, but her tone suggested she'd seen this pattern before. Mr. Morrison, I need to be direct. You're about to become one of the most powerful people on the planet. How you handle the next 30 days will define the rest of your life. I'd recommend taking time to think very carefully about who deserves to be part of your new reality. After Patricia hung up with promises to have a full team meet him tomorrow morning at a neutral location, David sat in the darkened hospital room, but his mind raced through possibilities and impossibilities with equal weight. Emma stirred slightly in her sleep, but the movement was so small it could have been imagination. I'm going to save you, baby girl, David whispered, but his voice carried a steel edge that hadn't existed an hour ago. And then I'm going to make sure everyone who abandoned you understands exactly what they threw away. His phone buzzed again, a text from Rachel. Marcus and I are going to dinner. Don't come home until after midnight. I don't want to see you. David stared at the message for a long moment, but then he opened his email and began reading the full inheritance documents. By the time the night nurse came to check Emma's vitals at 11 p.m., David Morrison had absorbed the details of an empire, but more importantly, he'd begun forming a plan that would turn betrayal into a lesson his wife and former best friend would never forget. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline sunlight that felt like mockery, but David sat in a private room at the Riverside Hotel, watching three men in expensive suits lay out the reality of his new existence. Patricia Thornwood had been joined by Harrison Cole, a white-haired attorney who specialized in asset protection, but the third man introduced himself as Dr. Werner Schmidt, head of experimental oncology at Basel Medical Institute. Your daughter's case is actually quite promising, Dr. Schmidt said, but he spoke with the confidence of someone who'd cured the incurable before. The leukemia strain is aggressive, but we've had a 78% success rate with a treatment protocol we developed last year. It's not yet approved in the United States, but that's a regulatory issue, not a medical one. Can you save her? David asked directly, but his hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I can have her transported to our Swiss facility by tomorrow evening, Dr. Schmidt replied, But he met David's eyes with absolute certainty. Given what Ms. Thornwood has told me about the financial resources available, I can provide not just the experimental treatment, but the absolute pinnacle of medical care. Your daughter will have her own wing, round-the-clock specialist attention, and access to treatments that most people don't even know exist yet. However, Harrison Cole interjected, but his tone was gentle despite the warning. Removing your daughter from County General will raise questions. Your wife has custodial authority. We need to handle this carefully. Patricia Thornwood pulled out a tablet and swiped through several documents, but her expression remained professionally neutral. We've done some preliminary research on your situation, Mr. Morrison. Your wife Rachel has been conducting an affair with Marcus Webb for approximately 26 months. We have credit card statements showing hotel visits, gifts purchased on joint accounts that you presumably didn't authorize, and text message records that paint a very clear picture. David felt sick, but he forced himself to ask, "How did you get text message records?" "Your wife and Mr. Webb both use their personal phones for company business," Harrison explained, but his tone suggested this was routine. Their employer's security protocols give us legal access to verify certain information. Everything we've obtained is admissible in court. The affair started 2 months after Emma's diagnosis, Patricia added quietly, but the timeline hit David like a physical blow. While you were working 3 jobs to cover medical bills, Rachel was spending evenings at the Grandview Hotel with your best friend. On 7 occasions they met while you were at the hospital with your daughter. David stood abruptly and walked to the window, but the city spread below looked different now. Smaller, more manageable, more conquerable. What are my options? Legally, we can file for emergency custody based on evidence of parental neglect, Harrison said, but he was already pulling up documents on his laptop. Rachel's decision to deny potentially life-saving treatment due to cost, combined with evidence of her affair, gives us strong grounds. But that's the nuclear option. It will be public, messy, and potentially traumatic for Emma. What's the alternative? David asked, but he didn't turn from the window. Patricia stood and joined him, but she spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. You give Rachel exactly what she wants. You sign the divorce papers without contest. You let her believe she's won. You move out, accept minimal custody, play the role of the defeated husband. She paused, but her next words carried weight. And then you systematically dismantle every dream she built with your betrayer, while saving your daughter's life through channels she'll never connect to you. That's cruel, David said, but his tone lacked conviction. She tried to separate you from your dying daughter while sleeping with your best friend, Patricia replied, but there was no judgment in her voice, just statement of fact. You're about to have power that most people can't even conceptualize. The question is whether you'll use it for immediate satisfaction or strategic justice. David watched the traffic flow below for another long moment, but his decision had already crystallized. I'll sign the papers, I'll move out, I'll play broken. He turned to face the 3 advisors, but his eyes had hardened into something new. And then I want to know everything about Marcus Webb's career, his finances, his ambitions, and exactly how to destroy all of it without him ever connecting it back to me. Harrison Cole smiled slightly, but the expression was predatory. Now you're thinking like someone who inherited a $1 trillion empire. The next 2 weeks unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, but every step had been planned in the private war room David had established in a penthouse suite Rachel didn't know existed. He'd signed the divorce papers without reading them, but his team of lawyers had already filed countermotions under seal that would take effect after the 30-day confidentiality period. He'd moved into a cheap motel on the edge of town, but the room was just a mailing address. His real nights were spent in luxury accommodations, planning the systematic education of his betrayers. Emma had been quietly transferred to Basel Medical Institute under the cover of a humanitarian medical trial, but Dr. Schmidt's daily reports showed remarkable progress. The treatment was working. His daughter was going to live, but Rachel didn't know this because David had allowed the county general doctors to believe Emma was still declining in their care. The real Emma was in Switzerland being saved, but a carefully maintained charade kept Rachel convinced her daughter was dying in America. Marcus Webb had indeed received his promotion to senior vice president, but what Marcus didn't know was that David now owned 72% of his company's parent corporation through a complex web of shell companies and investment funds. Harrison Cole had explained it with the patience of a chess master. We don't attack directly. We create conditions where your enemies destroy themselves while thinking they're winning. Rachel had wasted no time moving Marcus into their former home, but the house was still technically in both their names until the divorce finalized. David's security team had installed surveillance equipment during a scheduled maintenance visit, but the footage they collected wasn't for immediate use. It was for the perfect moment. That moment was being carefully constructed like a precision weapon, but David forced himself to be patient even as rage burned in his chest. Patricia Thornwood had been right. Immediate satisfaction would feel good for a day, but strategic destruction would deliver lessons that lasted lifetimes. On the 15th day after Rachel had kicked him out, David received permission to visit Emma at County General during approved hours, but he maintained his role as the defeated father perfectly. He shuffled in wearing his cheapest clothes, but his demeanor screamed, "Broken man." Rachel and Marcus were there, but they sat together on the small couch with the casual intimacy of people who no longer bothered hiding their relationship. "The doctors say she's not responding," Rachel said, but her tone was flat, rehearsed. "They've recommended we start discussing end-of-life arrangements." David felt his jaw clench, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. The real Emma was thousands of miles away, learning to walk again without assistance, but these people discussing her death had no idea. "What do you want me to do?" "Sign the DNR," Marcus said, but the audacity of David's former best friend speaking at all made something dangerous flash behind David's eyes. "It's the humane choice, buddy. She's suffering." The word buddy hung in the air like acid, but David swallowed his response. Instead, he looked at Rachel, but spoke with the quiet desperation of someone who'd already lost everything. "If I sign, will you let me be at her bedside at the end?" Rachel glanced at Marcus, but something in her expression suggested even she found this request difficult to deny. "You can have 2 hours a day. Marcus and I are planning the funeral." "Already?" David let genuine shock enter his voice, but he was mostly shocked that Rachel had sunk even lower than he'd anticipated. "We need to be practical," Rachel said, but she was already standing, clearly done with the conversation. "The hospital bills are mounting. Your portion of the debt will follow you into bankruptcy, but that's not my problem anymore. Marcus has been helping me understand how to protect my assets." "Our assets?" Marcus corrected with a smile, but he wrapped an arm around Rachel's waist with possessive certainty. "We're getting married next month, actually. Small ceremony, just close friends." David forced himself to nod slowly, but his mind cataloged this information with perfect clarity. "Congratulations, I hope you'll be very happy together." Something in his tone made Rachel look at him sharply, but David had already turned his attention back to Emma's empty bed, maintaining his performance. After they left, he waited exactly 15 minutes, but then he pulled out his secure phone and dialed Patricia Thornwood. "They're planning a wedding," David said without preamble, but his voice had gone cold. "Next month. Small ceremony." "I see," Patricia replied, but he could hear the clicking of her keyboard through the line. That accelerates our timeline. The 30-day confidentiality period ends in exactly 14 days. I'd recommend we plan the revelation for maximum impact. What did you have in mind? David asked, but he was already smiling. Marcus Webb's company is holding their annual gala in 17 days, Patricia said, but her tone suggested she'd been planning this conversation for a while. It's their biggest event of the year. All major investors, board members, clients. Marcus will be receiving his formal promotion announcement that night. Can we be there? David asked, but anticipation made his pulse quicken. Mr. Morrison, in 14 days you'll be the majority shareholder of the company hosting the event, Patricia replied, but amusement colored her words. You won't just be there, you'll own the room. The Basel Medical Institute's weekly reports had become David's lifeline, but each update brought relief that felt almost painful in its intensity. Emma was in full remission, but Dr. Schmidt cautioned that she'd need another 6 weeks of observation before being cleared for travel. David had visited her twice, but the trips to Switzerland required complete secrecy that his support team managed with military precision. "Daddy, when can I come home?" Emma had asked during his last visit, but her voice was stronger, her color better, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that made David's chest ache. "Soon, sweetheart," he'd promised, but he held her hand carefully, marveling at how close he'd come to losing her. "I'm making sure everything is perfect for when you get back." "Is Mommy coming to visit?" Emma's question was innocent, but it cut deeper than she could understand. David had practiced this lie until it sounded like truth. "Mommy's very busy right now, but she loves you very much. She asks about you every day." He'd forced himself to smile, but the expression felt like wearing a mask made of glass. "When you're all better, we'll have a big surprise party. Would you like that?" Emma had nodded enthusiastically, but David had left the Swiss medical facility with renewed purpose. His daughter deserved better than the mother who'd written her off as a lost cause, but she was too young to understand the full scope of Rachel's betrayal. In time, Emma would learn the truth, but for now, David would protect her from the ugliness. The Thornwood legal team worked with precision that bordered on artistic, but every move they made tightened the noose around Marcus Webb's carefully constructed career. Harrison Cole had discovered something delicious. Marcus's promotion to senior vice president had been contingent on landing a specific client account worth $40 million annually. Marcus had sealed that deal by promising his new bride Rachel would use her connections in the architectural community to bring additional business. Those connections were fictional. Rachel had worked as a real estate agent for 6 months before quitting, but she'd inflated her resume to Marcus with stories of major clients and industry relationships that didn't exist. Marcus had built his promotion on lies he'd believed without verifying, but he was about to discover that lies had consequences. "We've approached the client Marcus thought he'd secured," Patricia reported during one of their daily briefings, but her expression suggested satisfaction. "Offered them significantly better terms through one of our subsidiary companies. They jumped at the opportunity. Marcus's company loses the account effective next week." "Will they rescind his promotion?" David asked, but he was learning to read the chessboard several moves ahead. "Better," Harrison interjected, but he was grinning now. "They'll keep him in the position, but with his compensation tied to performance metrics, he can no longer meet. He'll be senior vice president in title, but his income will actually decrease 40%. And since he's been spending based on his expected salary increase, he's about to be drowning in debt," David finished. But the symmetry was almost poetic. Patricia nodded, but she pulled up additional documents on her tablet. "We've also quietly purchased the building where Marcus and Rachel are currently living. Your old house. The property was in foreclosure due to Rachel's spending habits during your marriage. You technically owned 50%, but she'd taken out additional liens without your knowledge. We've consolidated the debt, paid it off, and now own the property through a holding company." "So I own their home," David said slowly, but possibilities were unfolding in his mind. "You own their home, and we've instructed property management to begin formal eviction proceedings based on violations of occupancy terms in the foreclosure agreement," Harrison confirmed, but he was clearly enjoying this. "They'll receive notice 3 days before the company gala. Just enough time to panic, not enough time to find alternative arrangements." David sat back in his chair, but something still bothered him. What about Rachel? She must have some savings, some plan. Rachel Morrison has $17,000 in credit card debt, a car that's 2 payments from repossession, and her real estate license expired last year, Patricia said, but she delivered this information clinically. "She's been living entirely on Marcus's promises and your residual joint accounts, which we've frozen as part of the divorce proceedings. As of yesterday, she has $312 in accessible funds." "And she still thinks she's won," David murmured, but the observation was more wondering than vindictive. "She thinks she traded up from a poor contractor to a successful executive," Patricia agreed, but her expression held something like pity. "She has no idea that the poor contractor owns the building her successful executive works in, controls his career trajectory, and is about to repossess the home she's playing house in." The next 7 days passed with agonizing slowness, but David used the time to prepare for the company gala with the kind of attention most people reserved for military campaigns. His new stylist had transformed his appearance from exhausted contractor to sophisticated investor, but the changes were subtle: expensive haircut, tailored suit, confident posture. He looked like money without screaming it, but more importantly, he looked like power. "You clean up well, Mr. Morrison," Patricia observed during their final preparation meeting, but approval colored her tone. "Are you ready for this?" David adjusted his cufflinks, platinum with subtle diamond accents, but understated enough to avoid ostentation. "I've been ready since the moment Rachel told me I was too weak to reach my potential." The Madison Grand Hotel's ballroom glittered with the kind of opulence that came from corporate expense accounts, but the assembled crowd represented the city's financial elite. Marcus Webb stood near the front of the room, wearing his new senior vice president confidence-like cologne, but Rachel hung on his arm in a dress she definitely couldn't afford, playing the role of supportive partner with practiced ease. David entered through the main doors exactly as planned, but he didn't make a dramatic entrance. Instead, he moved through the crowd with Patricia Thornwood at his side, but he deliberately positioned himself where Marcus and Rachel couldn't miss seeing him eventually. The wait was part of the strategy. Let them notice him. Let confusion and concern build before the revelation. It took Marcus 7 minutes, but when his former best friend's eyes finally landed on David, the recognition was followed immediately by visible confusion. Marcus leaned down to whisper something to Rachel, but she turned to look, and her expression cycled through surprise, disgust, and finally, annoyance. They made their way over with the kind of reluctant obligation people feel toward embarrassing relatives, but Rachel spoke first. "David, what are you doing here? This is a private corporate event." "I was invited," David said, simply, but he let a small smile touch his lips. "I'm here representing some investment interests." "Investment interests?" Marcus's laugh was uncomfortable, but he was already looking around as if searching for security. "Buddy, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to leave before you embarrass yourself. This crowd is pretty far out of your league." "Is it?" David asked mildly, but he glanced at Patricia, who nodded slightly. Actually, Marcus, I was hoping to congratulate you on your promotion. Senior Vice President is quite an achievement. Something in David's tone made Marcus's eyes narrow, but Rachel stepped in before he could respond. It's more than you ever accomplished. Some people are built for success, David. Some people aren't. We've moved on. You should too. Oh, I have, David assured her, but the smile widened slightly. I've moved on quite a bit, actually. In fact, I've made some interesting investments recently. Patricia, would you mind? Patricia Thornwood pulled out her tablet with the efficiency of someone who'd choreographed this moment, but she spoke clearly enough for the small crowd around them to hear. Of course, Mr. Morrison, as of yesterday's close of business, the Thornwood Investment Group holds 72% controlling interest in Webb, Sterling and Associates, making Mr. Morrison the de facto chairman of the board. The silence that followed was profound, but Marcus's face had gone pale. That's not... You can't... I can, actually, David said, but his tone remained conversational. I've been reviewing the company's performance, and I have to say, Marcus, your recent client acquisition numbers are concerning, particularly that $40 million account you promised during your promotion interview. The Baxter account? Marcus's voice had climbed an octave, but he was struggling to process what was happening. That's secured. I closed that deal personally. You secured preliminary interest based on promises you couldn't keep, David corrected, but he spoke with the patience of a teacher explaining basic concepts. Unfortunately, Baxter Industries has decided to work with Apex Solutions instead. Better terms, more experienced team. I believe the contract was finalized this morning. Rachel's grip on Marcus's arm had tightened visibly, but her eyes were darting between David and Patricia like she was watching a tennis match she didn't understand. What's going on? Marcus, what is he talking about? Apex Solutions is one of Mr. Morrison's subsidiary companies, Patricia explained helpfully, but her expression remained professionally neutral. As is the holding company that purchased your current residence. In fact, you should have received eviction notice this afternoon, 30 days to vacate. The color drained from Rachel's face so quickly David thought she might faint, but she grabbed Marcus's jacket lapel for support. No, that's... David doesn't have money. He's bankrupt. He's living in a motel. I was living in a motel, David agreed, but he was enjoying this more than he'd expected. I've since upgraded. Funny thing about inheritance, sometimes it comes from family members you didn't know existed. My Uncle Jameson was quite successful, apparently. Left me his entire estate. How much? Marcus asked, but the question came out as a whisper. David pretended to consider the question, but Patricia answered for him. The Thornwood estate is currently valued at approximately $1.2 trillion, though that fluctuates with market conditions. The word trillion hit the gathered crowd like a shockwave, but conversations around them had stopped entirely. Rachel made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, but no words followed. Marcus had gone rigid, but his eyes held the trapped expression of someone watching their entire life collapse in real time. But that's not even the best part, David continued, but his voice had lost all warmth now. See, while I was working 3 jobs to save our dying daughter, you two were planning your future together. You kicked me out, Rachel. You told me I was weak, that I lacked ambition, that I'd never amount to anything. He paused, but let the words settle like sediment. You chose Marcus because you thought he represented success, while I represented failure. David, I didn't, Rachel started, but her voice cracked. You did, David interrupted, but his tone was final. You chose him while Emma was dying. You started your affair 2 months after her diagnosis. You spent money we didn't have on hotel rooms and gifts while I was begging for overtime shifts to cover her medication. You wrote off our daughter as a lost cause because you couldn't profit from her suffering. Emma's alive? Rachel's question emerged as barely a breath, but hope and horror fought for control of her expression. Emma is thriving, actually, David confirmed, but his smile was cold now. She's been receiving treatment at the best medical facility in the world for the past 3 weeks, full remission. She'll be home in about 6 weeks, healthy and whole, and completely saved by the money you thought didn't exist. Rachel's legs actually buckled, but Marcus caught her awkwardly, though he looked like he wanted to drop her and run. David watched them struggle to process this information, but he felt no satisfaction, only the cold certainty that justice was being served. Here's what's going to happen, David continued, but he spoke with the absolute authority of someone who controlled every variable. Marcus, your promotion is being rescinded effective Monday morning. Your compensation package is being restructured to reflect actual performance rather than promised potential. You'll have the opportunity to rebuild your career from the ground up, but it will be without Rachel's imaginary connections and without my former friendship. You betrayed someone who trusted you for what you thought was financial gain. Now you get to experience the reality you built. And Rachel, David turned his full attention to his soon-to-be ex-wife, but his expression was granite now. You wanted a divorce. You'll get one, finalized on terms my lawyers have already filed. You'll receive no alimony, no asset split beyond what you legally contributed, and no custody of Emma. I have documentation of your affair, proof of parental neglect, and testimony from medical professionals about your decision to deny treatment to our daughter. You'll have supervised visitation rights if Emma chooses to see you, but that choice will be entirely hers when she's old enough to understand what you did. You can't do this, Rachel whispered, but even she seemed to know the words were meaningless. I already have, David replied, but he stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Rachel, Marcus, and Patricia could hear. You taught me something valuable, Rachel. You taught me that the only thing worse than having nothing is believing you have everything, only to discover it was all built on lies. You thought you were trading up. You thought you were escaping poverty for prosperity, but you were just trading one illusion for another. He straightened his jacket and turned to Patricia, but spoke loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. Ms. Thornwood, I believe we have other engagements this evening. Please arrange for the car. As David walked toward the exit, he could feel the weight of every eye in the room following him, but he kept his spine straight and his pace measured. Behind him, he heard Rachel's first genuine sob, but he didn't turn back. Some lessons needed to be felt completely, but some wounds needed to be earned. The night air outside the Madison Grand hit his face with bracing clarity, but David paused on the steps, letting the moment sink in. He'd won. He'd destroyed them. He'd delivered justice for Emma and for himself, but the victory tasted more like ash than triumph. You handled that well, Patricia said quietly from beside him, but she was watching his face with professional concern. Are you all right? I don't know, David admitted, but the honesty felt strange after weeks of strategic deception. I thought I'd feel better. I thought watching them realize what they'd thrown away would bring some kind of satisfaction. Revenge rarely does, Patricia observed, but her tone wasn't judgmental. It delivers justice, closes loops, teaches lessons. But satisfaction, that comes from building something new, not from tearing down what was broken. David nodded slowly, but his thoughts were already turning toward Switzerland, toward Emma, toward the future he was building from the rubble of his past. When can I bring Emma home? Dr. Schmidt says 6 weeks, Patricia reminded him, but she pulled out her phone. However, I've been working on something. Give me a moment. She walked a few steps away, but David could hear her speaking, rapidly in German to someone on the other end. When she returned, her expression had softened slightly. Dr. Schmidt says if you want to bring Emma home early, he can arrange medical support here to continue her treatment. It's not ideal from a medical standpoint, but emotionally, he thinks seeing her father might accelerate her recovery more than staying in a sterile Swiss facility. How soon? David asked, but hope was unfurling in his chest for the first time in what felt like years. 3 days, Patricia replied. We'll need to set up a medical suite at whichever property you choose as your primary residence, but we have teams that can work miracles with short timelines. David closed his eyes for a moment, but when he opened them, the world looked different, not because of the money, not because of the power, but because his daughter was coming home. Let's do it. Make it happen. Consider it done, Patricia said, but she was already typing rapidly on her phone. One more thing, Mr. Morrison. Your ex-wife and Mr. Webb will likely attempt to contact you over the next few days. They'll apologize, they'll make excuses, they'll try to negotiate. How do you want to handle those attempts? David thought about this carefully, but his answer came from somewhere deeper than strategy. Block them completely. No calls, no messages, no contact. They made their choices. They lived their consequences. I'm done teaching lessons. Now I just want to focus on being the father Emma deserves. Understood, Patricia nodded approvingly, but she glanced back at the hotel where the gala was presumably still reeling from the revelation. For what it's worth, you handled tonight with more grace than most people in your position would have managed. Grace wasn't really the goal, David admitted, but he managed a small, genuine smile. But I think Emma would have been proud of me for not being cruel just because I had the power to be. She will be proud of you, Patricia corrected, but her words carried certainty. You saved her life, protected her future, and built a foundation for her to grow up without the shadow of poverty or desperation. That's worth more than any revenge. As David's driver pulled up, a subtle black sedan rather than an ostentatious limousine, because he was learning that real power didn't need to announce itself. He took one last look at the Madison Grand Hotel. Inside, Rachel and Marcus were probably still trying to process what had happened, but their processing wasn't his responsibility anymore. He'd been given a second chance at life through an uncle he'd never known. But the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the opportunity to rebuild himself, to be the father Emma needed, to create something meaningful from the wreckage of his previous existence. Take me to the penthouse, David told his driver, but he was already mentally redesigning the space to accommodate Emma's needs. And tomorrow I want to start looking at properties with larger yards. My daughter's going to want space to play when she comes home. Of course, Mr. Morrison, the driver replied, but David barely heard him. His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Schmidt. Emma asked me to tell you she loves you and she can't wait to come home. She's the bravest patient I've ever treated, but she says she gets that from her dad. David read the message 3 times, but tears blurred his vision before he could respond. He'd been given everything, power, wealth, the ability to reshape reality according to his will. But none of it mattered as much as those simple words from his daughter. The revenge he'd delivered tonight would echo through Rachel and Marcus's lives for years to come. But he realized now that wasn't really the point. The point was that Emma was alive, that she would have every opportunity she deserved, that the father she believed in hadn't actually failed her, even when everything seemed lost. Justice had been served, but mercy would define his future, and that, David thought as the car carried him toward his new life, was perhaps the most powerful inheritance of all. 6 months later, David Morrison stood in the massive backyard of his new estate, watching Emma play with her new puppy. But the scene was so perfect it felt almost unreal. She was completely healthy now, but more than that, she was happy, genuinely, radiantly happy in a way she'd never been during the dark days of her illness. "Daddy, watch this," Emma called out, but her voice carried the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd been given a second chance at childhood. The puppy, a golden retriever she'd named Hope with beautiful irony, bounded after a tennis ball with puppy clumsiness that made Emma dissolve into giggles. Patricia Thornwood approached from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, but she'd become more than just a legal advisor over the past months. She'd become a friend, a mentor, and occasionally a voice of reason when David's impulses leaned toward excessive generosity or lingering bitterness. The foundation received another 50 applications this week, Patricia reported, but she handed him a coffee before settling into the patio chair beside his. Emma's fund has already helped 37 families with children facing similar circumstances. The impact you're making is extraordinary. David had established the charitable foundation 3 months after Emma's return home, but the organization provided funding for experimental treatments that insurance companies refused to cover. He'd named it after his daughter because she'd inspired it, but more importantly because he wanted other children to have the same chance at life that she'd been given. "Have you heard anything about Rachel or Marcus?" David asked, but the question was more curious than vindictive now. Patricia nodded carefully. "Marcus is working as a junior analyst at a mid-tier firm. His reputation took a significant hit when word got out about the circumstances surrounding his promotion. He's rebuilding, but slowly." She paused before continuing. "Rachel has been living with her mother in Nevada. She's working part-time at a retail store. She's sent 17 letters requesting permission to see Emma, but we've maintained our position that any contact needs to wait until Emma is older and can make that choice herself." "Does Emma ask about her?" David wanted to know, but he was watching his daughter with careful attention. "Occasionally," Patricia admitted, "usually after therapy sessions where Dr. Williams helps her process the memories. She remembers that her mother was sick with her, but she also remembers feeling like her mother had already given up. It's complicated." "Yeah," David agreed, but he sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Has Rachel learned anything? Grown at all?" Patricia pulled out her phone and scrolled through some notes. Her latest letter was different from the others, less demanding, more introspective. She acknowledged her failures, admitted she'd prioritized her own desires over Emma's needs, and said she understands if Emma never wants to see her again. It was surprisingly mature, actually. David sat with this information for a long moment, but his feelings toward Rachel had evolved from rage to something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that people could grow from their worst moments. "What about Marcus? Has he reached out?" "Once," Patricia confirmed. 3 months ago, a single email expressing remorse and acknowledging the betrayal. He didn't ask for forgiveness or make excuses, just said he hoped Emma was healthy and that he understood why you never wanted to speak to him again. "That's something, I guess," David murmured, but he wasn't sure what emotion accompanied the words. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, but Emma eventually ran over with Hope scrambling at her heels, both of them panting from exertion. "Daddy, can Hope sleep in my room tonight, please?" David pretended to consider this very seriously, but he was already nodding. "I suppose we could make an exception, but Hope has to stay in her dog bed, not on your bed." "Deal!" Emma threw her arms around his waist in a fierce hug, but then she looked up at him with those serious brown eyes that reminded him of both her mother and himself. "Daddy, are you happy?" The question caught him off guard, but he realized Emma had been perceptive enough to notice his occasional moments of melancholy. "I'm very happy, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" "Sometimes you look sad when you think I'm not watching," Emma said with the directness only children possess. but her concern was genuine. "Are you sad about Mommy?" David knelt down to Emma's eye level, but he chose his words carefully. "Sometimes I'm sad about how things worked out between your mommy and me, but I'm never sad about you. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and I'm grateful every single day that you're here and healthy." "Can I see Mommy someday?" Emma asked, but her voice was small, uncertain. "When you're ready," David promised, but he meant it. "When you're old enough to understand everything that happened and you decide you want to see her, we'll make that happen. But it has to be your choice, not because anyone else thinks you should." Emma nodded thoughtfully, but then she brightened again. "Can we go get ice cream? Hope and I worked really hard playing, so we deserve a treat." "Hope is a dog. Dogs don't eat ice cream," David pointed out, but he was already standing up. "Then we'll get ice cream for us, and a special dog treat for Hope." Emma negotiated, but her grin was triumphant. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Morrison," David laughed, but he looked at Patricia. "Want to join us for ice cream?" "I could be persuaded," Patricia agreed, but as they walked toward the house, she spoke quietly enough that only David could hear. "You've done well by her, by yourself too. The bitterness could have consumed you, but you chose to build instead of destroy." "I destroyed plenty," David reminded her, but the words lacked heat. "You delivered consequences that were earned," Patricia corrected. "There's a difference. And then you moved on to create something meaningful. That's wisdom, not weakness." As they piled into the car for the short drive to Emma's favorite ice cream shop, David reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken man watching his daughter die while his world collapsed around him, but circumstances had given him power beyond imagination. He'd used that power for revenge, but then he'd used it for something better. Emma's laughter from the back seat reminded him what actually mattered, but the sound was worth more than all the money in his accounts. Rachel and Marcus had lost everything trying to grab at false security, but David had gained something infinitely more valuable by focusing on what was real: his daughter's life, her happiness, their future together. The revenge had been necessary. Some lessons could only be taught through consequences, but the healing that followed was what actually changed lives. But healing required letting go of the bitterness, even while maintaining the boundaries. "Daddy, what flavor are you getting?" Emma asked, but she was pressed against the car window, pointing at the ice cream shop coming into view. "I'm thinking mint chocolate chip," David replied, but he caught Patricia's eye in the rearview mirror and saw approval there. "What about you?" "Cookie dough," Emma announced, but then she paused. "No, wait, strawberry. No, both." "Both it is," David agreed, but as they parked and Emma scrambled out of the car with infectious enthusiasm, he allowed himself to feel genuinely content for the first time in what felt like forever. The inheritance had given him the means to save his daughter and deliver justice to those who'd betrayed them, but the real gift was the opportunity to rebuild his life with intention and purpose. He'd been called weak, been told he lacked ambition, been discarded as worthless, but he'd proven that strength came in many forms. And as he watched Emma order her ice cream with the confidence of a child who'd never known true suffering, David understood that the best revenge wasn't in destroying his enemies' lives. It was in building a life so full of love and purpose that their betrayal became irrelevant. They'd wanted to escape the burden of Emma's illness, but they'd missed the joy of Emma's survival. They'd traded temporary security for lasting regret, but he'd chosen temporary suffering for lasting triumph. The universe had given him justice, but David